Figueredo.
MSNBC's Chuck Todd, host of Meet the Press, really hates Bernie Sanders. Now, he hasn't explicitly said this, but I think it's evident. We all know it. It's an open secret at this point that he despises Bernie Sanders, and he is looking for any and all stories that could possibly discredit and ultimately defeat Bernie in 2020. And I've got two clips for you that demonstrate this as clear as day. Now, the first clip is honestly borderline self-parody, because throughout the midst of this segment, this anti-Bernie segment, they interrupt the segment to interject an ad from Boeing. Of all the advertisers, they chose Boeing, and it's glorious. So take a look, and then we'll come back and discuss this particular segment, because I think it is absolutely just, it really reveals their true intentions over at MSNBC.
When we come back, Endgame and why the second time around is looking a lot tougher for Bernie Sanders.
Coming up, Endgame, brought to you by Boeing, continuing our mission to connect, protect, explore, and inspire.
All right, before I go, Cornell, you're the pollster in the bunch. I want to put up a quick straw poll that we had from Daily Kos. This is our only 2020 comment. We're going to get to their thing. And it showed here, these are sort of activist Democrats. I put this up. Here are the top 5. Bernie Sanders sits at 11. 4 years ago, Bernie Sanders had nearly 70% of these folks. What's going on here?
Well, you also remember that Michelle Bachmann won straw polls after straw poll. A lot of what Bernie Sanders, I think, represented was the choice against Hillary Clinton in the primary. I think some of that was more a vehicle for anti-Hillary than a vehicle for pro-Bernie.
She'll say new is winning, that's for sure. All right, that's all I have for today.
And that's about what you'd expect from, a segment that was brought to you by Boeing. It's just, wow, they're so brazen. Maybe they thought of the optics and just thought, we'll roll with it anyway, but they did it. Now, I love this because he really, it's evident, right, that he's grasping for straws, because he wants you to think, and I think he's really trying to convince himself, that Bernie Sanders, Bernie 2020 is done. You can already stick a fork in it, because they did a straw poll. The Daily Kos conducted a straw poll from activist Democrats who he implied were progressives, which they're not. And since Bernie came in 5th place in this particular poll, he wants you to think that this is it. If he came in 5th place from a progressive outlet like the Daily Kos, then surely there's not going to be a chance for him or any room for him in the 2020 Democratic Party primary. Now, let me just ask you this, Chuck, before we move on. When you talk about the supposedly progressive outlet called the Daily Kos, are you talking about the same outlet that is run by establishment bootlicker Marcos Mulitsas, who's literally so proud of the fact that he creepily delivered thousands of roses to Nancy Pelosi that he actually pinned the picture of him doing it to his goddamn Twitter page? Is that the progressive outlet that you are referring to, Chuck Todd? Because I just want to be clear and make sure we're on the same page and that we're both referring to the same, quote, progressive, unquote, outlet. Now, I could get into the rest of the gripes that I have with this, but I'm not going to do that, because David Dole of the Rational National, my brother from another mother, actually did an amazing job outlining the absurdity of that clip and how Boeing, who sponsored that clip, actually has it out for Bernie Sanders. So I will link to that down below. You have to check it out if you haven't already seen that. Now, this may surprise you, but there's another clip featuring Chuck Todd trying to smear and discredit Bernie Sanders. But this one is a bit more nefarious. Take a look.
Welcome back. Tonight in 2020 Vision, Bernie Sanders is apologizing again, this time for allegations of harassment on his 2016 presidential campaign. Could this derail his chances of another presidential bid? Take a listen to this apology.
What they experienced was absolutely unacceptable, and certainly not what a progressive campaign or any campaign should be about.
Bernie Sanders is facing backlash after new allegations of sexual harassment against one of his former top campaign aides. According to Politico, his convention floor leader, Robert Becker, is accused of forcibly kissing a junior staffer. The woman only came forward when Becker recently contacted her to be part of the team for another Sanders presidential campaign.
So I certainly apologize to any woman who felt that she was not treated appropriately. And of course, if I run, we will do better next time.
This isn't the first time that Sanders has had to answer for misconduct by male staffers on his 2016 presidential campaign. 2 stories in the last month detailed a, quote, pervasive culture of toxic masculinity.
And just to be clear, you seem to indicate that you did not know at the time about the allegations. Is that correct?
Yes, I was a little bit busy running around the country trying to make the case.
Boy, is that a tough answer to defend, of course, because if you're running to be president of the United States, you can't manage a campaign. How do you manage the country concepts? That's a tough answer to defend. These stories, Elizabeth Warren's successful early rollout in this race, and politically speaking, no potential 2020 candidate has had a worse start to 2019, it looks like, than Bernie Sanders.
No potential 2020 candidates had a worse start than Bernie Sanders. Really, Chuck? Is that based on facts? Or is that what you want to believe? Because there's been no single candidate who's declared yet that had a nationwide call, 400 different house parties across the nation, all of which asked him to run for president. Has any other candidate, Elizabeth Warren, Tulsi Gabbard, Kirsten Gillibrand, Richard Ojeda, has any other candidate had that? Has any other candidate had even a fraction of the grassroots support already as Bernie? So what he's saying there, it's not the truth. It's just something that he wants you to believe. And what I find interesting is that these propagandists are showing their cards a little bit too early, because he says, could this derail Bernie Sanders' chances of another presidential bid? I bet that he hopes it does, but he says that before he even talks about the article. So, I mean, if you want to discuss the implications of the New York Times article, then you can do that. I think that's legitimate. That's fine. But if you obviously are gleefully hoping that this derails his chances, then you are demonstrating to us that you have a bias. Now, he also ended that segment by saying, boy, is that a tough answer to defend. Of course, because if you're running to be president of the United States, you can't manage a campaign. How do you manage a country? Now, I wonder if Chuck Todd is going to ask that same question when it comes to Kamala Harris, who just last month had a top aide resign due to allegations of sexual harassment. I wonder if he asked that same question back in 2016 when it comes to Hillary Clinton, who did nothing about sexual harassment in 2008 and also had the same thing happen in 2016. You see, the reason why this is so nefarious is because what people like Chuck Todd and members of the media want you to believe is that sexual harassment, it's a Bernie problem. Nobody else had this problem, when in actuality, it's not a Bernie problem. It's an America problem. It's a problem that we have in this country culturally. The problem is toxic masculinity. The problem is sexism in the workplace everywhere. It probably is happening at MSNBC. In fact, I'd be surprised if it weren't happening at MSNBC. So to suggest that this is something that exclusively affected Bernie Sanders is incredibly disingenuous. It's outright propaganda. But I'm not going to go through and tell you what I think about him and why it's so nefarious, because the actual woman, Juliana de Lara Velez, who was cited in that New York Times article, spoke out, and she summed up the situation better than I ever could. She writes in an op-ed for The Intercept, "Last week, my experience and that of some of my female co-workers became the focus of a New York Times story on the sexual harassment and sexism that took place in the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign. I told my story to bring attention to the sexist environment that is unfortunately endemic to most workspaces, including political campaigns. However, I was disheartened to discover that the takeaway by many pundits was not that sexism and harassment is pervasive, but that Sanders was somehow uniquely culpable. I was also struck by some of the messages and tweets calling into question the character of the women who spoke out. As was the case throughout the 2016 campaign season, my personal experiences as a woman of color were sublimated to serve an establishment media narrative that pretends the progressive movement is all white, all male, and runs counter to the interests of women and people of color. But my story should not be taken to confirm the Bernie bro mythology. It should be taken to confirm the pervasiveness of sexism in professional life and distill the hard truths that all campaigns campaigns should learn from. It's not as if the Sanders campaign alone is nursing the last vestiges of sexism and sexual harassment in the political sphere. Both were reportedly features of Hillary Clinton's 2008 campaign. During her first run at the White House, Clinton's campaign chose to retain a senior advisor who reportedly harassed a young woman repeatedly rather than fire him. And just last month, an aide for Senator Kamala Harris resigned after it was reported that he settled a sexual harassment lawsuit for $400,000. For one, the corporate media unfairly focuses on Sanders, casting the harassment that happened within his campaign much differently than similar cases with other campaigns, implicating his personal ethics in a way that they've declined to do with other politicians. Sanders recently apologized and acknowledged that his 2016 campaign could have handled sexual harassment and sexism claims better, and in his 2018 re-election campaign, he reportedly instituted sharper protocols like better hiring, training, and designating an independent firm that staff could utilize to report sexism and harassment. But new allegations of sexual harassment in his 2016 campaign have since surfaced, indicating the depth of the problem was likely deeper than most knew. Now, Sanders should take the rare step of setting up an independent investigation into the 2016 allegations. Now, that was said perfectly. How can you hold Bernie Sanders to a different standard and pretend as if this same phenomenon isn't prevalent in other campaigns? How could you do that? It's almost as if propagandists in the mainstream media have an agenda to smear and discredit Bernie Sanders at all costs, even if that means exploiting the misfortune of some women who served on Bernie Sanders' campaign. That is disgusting. And look, I'll be fair and say that I could see how Bernie Sanders could be painted in a negative light if he knew about these allegations at the time and did nothing, or if he knew about them and chose to trivialize them and didn't take them seriously. But he is taking them seriously. Not only did he apologize, but he met with female staffers. He set up an independent firm that 2018 and 2020 staffers can go to in order to report instances of sexual harassment. And knowing Bernie Sanders, he's likely going to take her advice and set up an independent investigation into the 2016 campaign. Because that's the way that Bernie Sanders is. He genuinely cares about this issue. He's been a feminist his whole life. So of course, he's going to take what women are saying to heart and try to improve. Can you say the same for Hillary Clinton in 2008, who chose to retain someone who sexually harassed staffers? Now, I don't want to just have this get reduced down to a whataboutism. You know, it's clear that this is something that is a problem that as Americans we need to address, but I hate how the mainstream media conveniently ignores all these other stories about how prevalent sexual harassment in the workplace and political spaces are, but they love to just chide Bernie Sanders for something that they're saying he's culpable for, or at least implying he's culpable for. Well, here's the thing, Chuck. If you're going to be a propagandist, you've got to do better. You've got to be a little bit more subtle, because it's easy for us to see through the bullshit. But unfortunately for Chuck Todd and others at MSNBC, nobody takes you seriously. Why? Because we all know that MSNBC hosts, they are put on this leash. And we know this because the late Ed Schultz, who was a progressive, he kind of blew the lid off of your operation. When he tried to cover Bernie Sanders, he explained how he got a call from the president of MSNBC saying, no, you're not going to do that. You are not allowed to cover Bernie Sanders. So I will leave you with that, because I think it's more relevant now going into 2020 and the 2019 Democratic Party primary than ever.
There was more oversight and more direction given to me on content at MSNBC than there ever has been here at RT. And I think that it's very sad that that story is not getting out. I think it's many times I was told what to lead with on MSNBC. Many times I was told what I was not going to do, and I've got a story that, had I not been involved in it, I would have never believed it. And Phil Griffin, who I consider a friend to this day, was a watchdog, far more than anything I am exposed to here at RT America.
Did he tell you what to say? Did he tell you an angle to take?
Often.
This segment of the Humanist Report was brought to you by TYT. To support the Humanist Report and TYT simultaneously, you can become a TYT insider for $4.99 per month by going to tyt.com/thehumanist-report, or you can go to tyt.com/thr to become a $10 member. You'll get access to all of TYT's shows, post-game extras, as well as behind-the-scenes content. So sign up today at tyt.com.